Are you ready?
And welcome into the Hotty Toddy Hotline from the Hampton Inn, just off Jackson Avenue in Oxford, Mississippi. I'm Jon Rawl, the executive producer. I'm in this week for Browning Stubbs, who has a much-deserved spring break going on this week. But before Browning took off to the beach, he was able to track down a New Orleans television personality to get his take on Ole Miss sports and more. So we'll have that coming up later in the show. But we do welcome in from HottyToddy.com Steve Vassallo. And Steve is a contributor and a columnist on that website and knows a whole lot about Ole Miss sports and a whole lot about Ole Miss and Oxford history. Hello, Steve.
John, welcome. It's good to be here today.
And he was on about a month ago with Browning, and we're glad to have him back. We're going to talk with Steve about Ole Miss basketball. Their season comes to a tragic end.
John, unfortunately, it did come to a tragic end. And, John, I'm as angry as the voting American electorate about this basketball season. We were only one of 4 teams in the SEC this year that won 20 games, and yet we're finding ourselves nowhere, going nowhere. NIT, NCAA, and I think that's a travesty. I really do. That this good of a team that won 20 basketball games with the most electrifying player in the United States and Stephon Moody, and we're sitting at home. Give me a break. And when you look at some of the teams in the SEC that were invited to the NIT, looking at Alabama, a team that barely was in the race at all. They had an 8-10 season in the SEC standings. We were 10-8, and they were 18-14 overall. But yet they were invited, and Ole Miss sits at home. I just don't think it's fair, and I'm not very pleased with it.
All right, and I'm the lucky guy that gets to sit by him this week, so I'm going to kind of be on the defensive here. But no, we'll talk about that. And it's one thing to be shut out of the NCAA tournament, but to be shut out of the NIT is kind of questionable. So we'll talk about that and a whole lot more. We've got an update on Ole Miss baseball. All that coming up on this week's Hotty Toddy Hotline.
Hey, Rebels, your truck is here. Allen Samuels Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Oxford presents the all-new Ram Rebel. It's Ram, the Rebel way. Send an unmistakable signal. Rebel 24/7. Ram Rebel from your friend in the car business. Allen Samuels Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Oxford.
Come by, let's be friends.
And we welcome you back into the Hampton Inn, and this is a Charter Road property right here in Oxford, Mississippi, one of many Charter Road hospitality properties in Oxford, Mississippi. I'm Jon Rawl. I'm the executive producer. I'm in this week for Browning Stubbs. We've got Steve Vassallo of HottyToddy.com and an Ole Miss sports enthusiast. And you even went on the road this year to Gainesville, Florida to see Ole Miss play basketball against Michael White's Gators earlier this season. So you keep up with basketball and a lot more. The big news in Oxford this week is how in the world Ole Miss, with over 20 wins, can end up being short of the NCAA tournament and the NIT. My goodness, the NIT and the NCAA in recent years has expanded. I think it's, 68 teams in the NCAA now, and the NIT has maybe 32?
Right, that's correct.
So you're telling me Ole Miss isn't one of the top 100 teams, roughly?
It's ridiculous, John. It is simply ridiculous.
Okay. Well, let's explain how this happened. My critique here isn't necessarily just for Ole Miss's sake, but the Southeastern Conference really had a poor showing. They had 2 teams get in that deserved it, Kentucky and Texas A&M. Vanderbilt barely slid through the door. They got into the first 4. So who else possibly could have gotten into the NCAA besides Vanderbilt? Maybe LSU?
Maybe LSU. And LSU, to my understanding, they were invited to the NIT and refused the invitation.
Okay.
But let's talk about Vanderbilt just for a minute. They're an 11 seed in the NCAA tournament, whereas you've got Kentucky, a number 3 seed, and Texas A&M, a number 4 seed. Vanderbilt won 19 basketball games during the regular season. We won 20. But yet we didn't even get invited to the NIT.
Who won the head-to-head? Was it Ole Miss?
Ole Miss. So it makes you wonder why Ole Miss wasn't included. Another thing I didn't realize at the time of the SEC tournament, the matchup between Ole Miss and Alabama, apparently that was an elimination game, John, for the NIT. But who would have thought it at the time?
Well, Alabama does have a resurgent program. They've got a new coach who, of course, has NBA head coaching experience. They're excited about basketball, but in the regular season contest between these two teams, Ole Miss won that game in Oxford.
Correct. And then Florida, for example, another NIT team, 19 and 14, 19 wins, similar to Vanderbilt. Unfortunately, Ole Miss did lose twice to them, so you could make a case why Florida and not Ole Miss for the NIT. But when you look at the overall record and worksheet, you would think that Ole Miss would have gotten a better draw, which they did not.
So, again, it's disappointing for Ole Miss, but it's really disappointing for the Southeastern Conference. This is a conference that's fought for a long time to show the rest of the NCAA that basketball does matter in this conference, and it's been hard to do that when you've had essentially a one-team conference in Kentucky that has won championships, at least in the last decade. I know Florida won several back in the 2000s, but man, what a black eye this is for the conference to have such a poor showing of selections in the tournament.
In my lifetime, I can never remember as few as 3 teams, and maybe there have been years where there were only 3 teams, but when you look at, we don't have anything higher than a number 3 seed. So in all reality, looking ahead, we probably will not have a team in the Sweet 16. I wouldn't think so. When you've got a 3, a 4, and 11, it just doesn't seem probable.
Yeah, well, congratulations to Texas A&M. They actually were the so-called conference regular season champions because they did beat Kentucky head-to-head. They did lose to the Cats in the SEC tourney in Nashville in an overtime game, but great job down there in College Station by the Aggies this year. Good for them, bad for, I guess, everybody else. Again, I mean, you got a conference with the supposed number 1 draft pick in the NBA at LSU. They're not even going to the postseason.
Right.
You had maybe the most exciting player, as you said, Stephon Moody from Ole Miss, in the whole NCAA, a guy that scored just 40-something points the other day here in Oxford in I think it was his finale in the Pavilion, and they're not going anywhere.
And another thing, too, I'm not a big Gamecock fan by any means, but they did win 24 basketball games, and they are going to the NIT, but why are they not in the NCAA, I can't
Well, they lost a lot of games down the stretch. They played a very weak schedule, but they still won 24 games, and they're coached by a guy that's regarded as one of the better coaches in basketball, Coach Martin, who came there from Kansas State. And, look, they haven't been to the NCAA tournament since 2004, so for the first chance to go in a dozen years, it would have been a big deal. But now you've got Auburn, who hasn't been to the tourney since 2003, and South Carolina 2004. I think other than the very handful of teams that have not gone to the NCAA tournament in their history, Northwestern is one of those teams, this is pretty embarrassing to see teams not get in the NCAA tourney. And Ole Miss, I don't mean to put a knife in the back here, but they didn't get in this year, and they barely got in last year. I mean, they had to go to a first 4, so things aren't exactly hunky-dory in Oxford. I know with Andy Kennedy that first year that they beat Wisconsin in that first game, and then the team from Philadelphia they played in the second game that they won, they lost barely. That was a chance to go to the Sweet 16. It's hard to believe that this program with this almost $100 million facility and the support that it does have only has one Sweet 16 appearance in its history.
Right. That's I was at that game in San Antonio. Rod Barnes was our coach that year.
Congratulations to Rod Barnes. And he's in the NCAA tournament this year.
If I remember correctly, we lost that game to Arizona, and thinking back, we had a fairly large, sizable lead near the end of the first half, and the whistle started blowing, and I have never seen a lead vanish in my life because of fouls. I'll never get over that, but that was a Rod Barnes team and a very exciting Ole Miss basketball team. John, can we get back just a minute ago? You briefly mentioned it about Stephon Moody's 40-point game against State.
Sure.
That was the finale this year in the Pavilion, and I have very few times in my life, and I've been following this team now for 50 years, I've seen a performance of that quality. It reminded me of the Johnny Newman years, going back that far. You don't see many 40-point games ever, even now, let alone when Newman played, they didn't have the three-point shot. But what Moody accomplished that night was spectacular.
And what was amazing on the flip side of that is you had for Mississippi State the player, I believe Malik Newman is his name, that was the top player in the state and maybe even one of the best players in the entire country that signed with Mississippi State. I heard he scored 3 points in that game.
Is that right? There's inside man who I'm at a loss for his name right now, had a 24, 25-point game. And those were the two big scores.
Well, their star player that everybody wanted, even Ole Miss, had 3 points from what I was told. I didn't see the box score, but of complete opposite ends on that game in the Pavilion, which I guess is going to be the last game of the Ole Miss basketball year in Oxford, at least, as they didn't even make the NIT. That's one thing I was thinking. If they didn't make the NCAA tournament, at least they would make some money perhaps off the NIT, because you do play games at home, and they would probably pack the place out, but that's not going to happen. We're going to come back and continue our discussion with Steve. We're going to talk some more Ole Miss basketball and other basketball notes. We've got some baseball talk coming up, plus a special interview Browning did before he hit the beach. Stay with us here on Hotty Toddy Hotline. And we're back here at Hotty Toddy Hotline from the Hampton Inn on Jackson Avenue in Oxford. We encourage you to stop by this property as well as any of the other sister properties of Charter Road Hospitality. It's baseball season now. You can come up to Oxford and spend a great weekend. You know, it'd be nice if you maybe owned a condo or a very nice place in Oxford, but the reality is you don't have to. When you have these wonderful properties here, you can come into Oxford and they'll do the laundry for you, and you can just leave the room a mess and come back the next series if you want. It's just a great place here, the Hampton Inn, and the Holiday Inn Express is just behind us here. Check it out, Charter Road Hospitality. I'm Jon Rawl with Steve Vassallo of HottyToddy.com, and Steve has been covering Ole Miss basketball since the 60s. He was the play-by-play announcer for Ole Miss when they opened the Tad Pad back in the 66 season?
65-66.
Okay, 65-66 season. And I heard you on the show the other week talk about the opening season of you being involved with that program. And do you remember who the first opponent was in the Tad Pad?
I really don't, but I do remember distinctly the highlight of my freshman year interviewing Coach Adolph Rupp for Kentucky, and they went to the finals that year, John, of the NCAA. And I'm not sure if that was the first game in the Tad Pad or not, but it was a brutal game. They beat us about 50 points. And all that Rupp wanted to talk to about after the game were two errant passes as point guard Tommy Cron made. And I thought, what a perfectionist. They've just won a game by 50 points, and all he's focusing on are two bad passes.
Well, he was a superstitious guy. In fact, I've heard stories about on those Kentucky basketball trips to Oxford back in the 60s, I guess when the Tad Pad opened, the Kentucky basketball team would stay at what is now called the Graduate Hotel, but originally, I don't even know what it was before it was the Holiday Inn in that same site just north of the square, but that's where they would stay. And Coach Rupp, I don't know if you've ever heard the story, he refused to get on the bus to go to the game until he went in the parking lot and looked in the grass and found a hairpin that women wear.
I've never heard that one.
Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true. He was a very superstitious guy, and I've heard that happened here in Oxford. I'm sure it happened a lot of other places. To answer your question, I don't know why I'm having a senior moment here. The first person, because he told me this, to score a basket in the Tad Pad was Kentucky's All-American and went on to be a player and has been a long-time television color commentator. Larry Conley. He scored the first basket.
Well, then that was the first game. In fact, I talked to Larry last year in the Tad Pad when he was announcing one of the games about reflecting back on that era, and Larry remembered it like it was yesterday.
He did, and I talked to him on his last game broadcasting in the Tad Pad when there was still the Jefferson Pilot Network, because he really thought at that time they were going to get rid of him because he was an old guy. I'm glad to see that someone out there kept him around because he's a good guy, even though he played for Kentucky. He really thought that the whole youth movement going on and color commentating was going to exclude him, but evidently he's still calling games and all that.
And John, to tell you how basketball has changed, Larry Conley was a starting 6'3" forward for that team.
Oh, really? Okay.
6'3", but he was just a great
That's my
outside
height.
shooter.
I don't think I could be a forward. Going back on a little bit of history, you talked about Johnny Newman, who you did a great story on HottyToddy.com about him.
Thank you.
Johnny Newman played here in the early 70s. He played only 1 year?
One season, he led the nation in scoring.
Okay, 1 year, unbelievable scorer, and went on to play for the Memphis ABA team, which was the Memphis Pros, I think, at that time.
The TAMS.
TAMS. Well, they changed their name 3 consecutive years. And anyway, the interesting story, I'm sure you know about this, but the head coach of LSU in those days was Press Maravich. And Johnny Newman had some kind of record going when LSU played Ole Miss in basketball here at the Tad Pad in those early 70s in that one season. And Johnny Newman was set to break that record in that game. Have you heard the story?
Yes, I have.
And go ahead. You
well,
finish.
I'll let you finish it. Johnny, in fact, shared that with me recently. But
Okay.
go ahead.
Well, essentially what happened was Press knew that Johnny Newman was about to break his son's record, and so he held the ball for like 4 and 5 minutes at a time, which you could do in those days.
That's right. There was no shot clock violation.
And LSU was getting beat, if I'm not mistaken, but he didn't care. He just didn't want his son's record to go down to Johnny Newman.
Well, that LSU-Ole Miss rivalry extends beyond football.
Kind of a strange story, but speaking of the folks from down south, we're going to come back after this break. Browning Stubbs, before he took off on spring break, he's still working hard for us here at Hotty Toddy Hotline. He caught up with a guy that's kind of a famous person in the Crescent City of New Orleans and does a lot of sports coverage. We're going to have that conversation with Browning coming up after the break. Stay with us here on Hotty Toddy Hotline, and after that interview, Steve and I are going to come back and wrap up the show with a little baseball talk. This is Hotty Toddy Hotline.
Because you want more flavor, at Nuke's we marinate and grill to perfection. Because you want the latest culinary tastes and trends, we never rest. At Nuke's, great food drives us. So we are meticulous in our preparation, obsessed with the quality of our ingredients, and uncompromising about serving you our very best. We believe that sharing a memorable meal is one of life's ultimate pleasures. Join us at Nuke's Eatery.
Hampton Inn on Jackson Avenue in Oxford, and I'm Browning Stubbs, and I just wanted to do a quick segment on Hotty Toddy Hotline before I hit town on spring break. And I'm joined now on the phone by WLAE-TV's Scott Alexander in New Orleans. Scott, what's up, man?
I'm jealous that you're going on spring break, Browning. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well, Scott. I'm headed to Miami, going to the Ultra Music Festival. Do you have any fun spring break stories you want to share?
Oh, my goodness. They're not suitable for radio, but I have made it down to Miami several times. I don't know if I've been to that festival, but when I was your age, I think I was hitting the Destin mostly. That was kind of the thing we did a lot back in the 80s, but it's always a good time.
Yeah, and Miami's got to be a special place for Saints fans, right?
There's no doubt about it. I mean, heck, the Holy Grail that most of us here thought that would never happen did occur in Miami back on February 7th, 2010, when the Saints finally got to the Super Bowl. And for a long-suffering fan like myself, I'm basically the same age as the team. I've suffered through the old, back when they played 14 games, 2-12, 3-14, the 1-15 season. I should say 3-13, but 1-15 season when they went to 16. So when they finally got it done, it was a parade for about a month here.
Yeah, and a lot of Saints fans, Scott, where I am in Oxford, and man, we had quite the party down there in the Big Easy over New Year's. Ole Miss playing in the Sugar Bowl. What'd you think about all that?
I mean, listen, Ole Miss fans, quality group. You can't go wrong when they're roaming around the French Quarter. A lot of good-looking people. It's just good folks. And listen, always have loved Ole Miss. I remember taking road trips to see REM when I was in college to Oxford, having a good time. I went to school in Baton Rouge, and I have a special place in my heart. I was producing games for years with Tim Brando, and I remember sitting at the Grove, at the grill at the Grove, or that restaurant next to a bar. And I remember watching all the beautiful girls come in and having AD John Schaefer sitting with us. And then the SID Langston was talking about how you at Ole Miss, Scotty, my boy, y'all don't redshirt All-Americas at Ole Miss, you redshirt Miss Americas. And it was quite evident that night.
Yeah, you're certainly right about that. Scott, you're from the New Orleans area. You got to know Archie Manning, so could kind of talk about your relationship with Archie.
Other than Pistol Pete Maravich, growing up as a kid here in the 70s, there was nobody I idolized more. I remember the day I met him, I think I was 11 years old, and I was snuck into Tulane Stadium. I didn't even and the Saints had just started moving over to play the games at the Dome. They had played at Tulane Stadium for the first, say, 8 years or so, but they still practiced there a good bit. So he was there before practice. I was kind of sneaking in, watching it from the stands, hoping I wasn't going to get caught. And I just yelled out to him, he was the only guy on the field at the time. He's stretching. He just walked on over and said hi. And, I'm sure he doesn't remember that, although he claims he does. I got to work with him for a few years producing the Saints preseason games for TV. Brando, who I worked with a lot during that stretch, he was calling the games with Archie and got to know him pretty well, had some funny stories there. And then most recently got a chance to introduce him to a group in Hickory, North Carolina, of all places, a black tie event, just all men. And I was the intro guy for Archie. It was a free trip, and it was a fun time. And I had about 10 to 12 minutes to take my cracks at Archie, and he quickly took the stage and took his right back at me, and his are a lot better than mine. He's just a fun guy to be around.
And Scott, I've got to get you to come to Oxford because Archie has a sandwich that's named after him at the Ajax Diner on the square in Oxford. It's called the Big Easy. I'm going to ask you, take a wild guess. What do you think is on this sandwich?
Gosh, I probably should know this, but if it's in New Orleans, is it seafood based, or is there something that has to do with Archie in particular? I don't know. What could it be?
So it's a sandwich that has a country fried steak topped with mashed potatoes and gravy and butter beans. Can you imagine?
Oh, my gosh. Are you kidding me?
Dead serious.
I pride myself on almost being able to eat anything, but I'm not sure I could even handle that one.
Come on. You can do it once for Archie.
Is it butter beans on a sandwich?
Yeah.
I could give it a shot. It sounds like it's just different. Maybe that's a delicacy over there in Drew, Mississippi. But Archie, by the way, I'm not old enough to really remember him playing college football at Ole Miss, but man, I am a slave to history, and I have dug up so many amazing highlights and even full games of watching this guy play. And there is no one that can convince me that he wasn't one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of college football. And if he had been with a better pro team instead of basically an expansion team in New Orleans, his pro career could have been similar. But
I agree.
He had no one to block for, and he had many injuries. But for those young people out there, there's a lot to be proud of to have Archie Manning as part of your alumni base.
And, I have to bring up the most recent news, Scott. And Archie Manning, of course, grew up in New Orleans, raised 3 boys, Cooper, Peyton, and Eli. And Peyton Manning just announced last week his retirement from the NFL. He will end a glorious 18-year career, 2 Super Bowl titles, set many passing records. What do you think about Peyton's decision to finally hang up the cleats?
It was a good one. How can you do better than going out on top? I didn't want to see him, be the guy that just tried to hang on for whatever reason. A lot of guys
like Favre,
but that's not an issue. He needs to do. Favre's was more for ego, and it's just, I don't even want to say ego in the wrong way. I meant ego in the sense that it's just hard to give up something you just love and you've been doing for so long. I think it's devastatingly hard for Peyton, and it will be when it comes time. That clock around mid-July is going to tell him that, training camp's around the corner, and he's not going to be there. And I hear it from so many people that have retired and, gone into different facets, some in the media that I've worked with. But Peyton of all, he really has come from just football and bred. We all know this, and bred from the time that he was born. And this is going to be hard for him. But he went out on top, Browning, and listen, we as a New Orleanian, We like to take pride in the people that are from here and in the region in general, but it's hard for me to imagine that you can be more proud of a guy that handles himself with such class than Peyton Manning.
Absolutely. And Scott, with Peyton's retirement, it's going to be sad for the NFL, but I agree. I think he made the right decision. Now, Eli Manning had a special tribute to him. Showed old videos and photos of when they were kids. Did you catch that video?
I did. I actually just saw it this afternoon, and I thought that was wonderful. The Mannings. Eli, people forget Eli's like he's a lot younger than the other two. I'm way down the line myself. I mean, he's about the same age difference. I think 6 or so years from Peyton. I know what that's like to be the little baby. I mean, I have 4 older siblings, and the next one is 6 years older. So you really are kind of alone a little bit. You just, in the way you look up to those, it's a little different than having one 1 or 2 years older. It's like you really do look up to them. And now that both of them are double Super Bowl winners, people don't think of that, but Eli still looks up to him. And I think in a sense he always will. And it came across in that wonderful tribute. I was very moved and touched by that thing. And once again, maybe if I'm from Alaska or Idaho or some other area that doesn't really care about the Mannings like we do here, maybe I wouldn't be. But I think it still would touch most people. And much like Peyton's own retirement speech, which, I mean, goodness, I wasn't old enough to hear Lou Gehrig's in person or live, but I have watched it several times back in 1939. And honestly, other than that one, I can't think of a speech by a guy retiring that has moved me more than the one Peyton did. And Eli made that sentiment clear when talking about his own brother.
Now, the show must go on. Scott, now let's kind of get more into what you do. You live in New Orleans. You have primetime sports with Scott Alexander on WLAE-TV, and you're doing some shows there. So kind of talk to us about what you're doing there.
It's a new project. Listen, I am a New Orleanian through and through, but I left for 30 years. I was gone for quite a while. Went to D.C. for a bunch of years, worked in politics for a bit, went back to law school at LSU, but then I left again for another 20 or so years and spent that in Atlanta. And so I was close enough to get home for crawfish fixes, et cetera, but I was gone, and I spent much of that time in the TV, sports television business, TNT and Fox, and I went to become an agent in 2004. And honestly, from probably the moment I left, I didn't realize I was going to miss TV as much as I did. And did a lot of producing, but I also did some on-air stuff. But I really enjoyed the producing part more. I really love to put the shows together. And being on was cool too, but just the whole deal. So I'm kind of doing both of that again. I left the agent business about 4 years ago. I've been working ESPN radio for a long time, doing shows with them, and radio is great. I love it. It was a great avenue for me to express views, and obviously, let's face it, at 50, I certainly don't look anywhere near I did when I was younger, so I'm probably more suited for radio these days. But fact is I was looking for something else, and what I've done now is this show is kind of a niche. It's kind of I'm trying to make it like a Tonight Show of New Orleans in the region. By having a band, like, 3-piece band, jazz band. We have guest musicians, even only 4 weeks in, that pop in and join. But we also have some of the local royalty or the region royalty, like the first Hall of Famer ever to, from the Saints is Ricky Jackson. He's joined me. Your own Deuce McAllister, who I really love on and off the field, and I've been fortunate enough to get to know him well because I used to do shows at his restaurant. He joined me, and just a whole group of former Saints. I've had a couple of current Saints, including that cornerback Delvin Breaux and his great story. Tonight we had a couple former Tulane players. One, the quarterback that's going to Nebraska, Tanner Lee, who transferred because they have a new system with the new coach bringing in the option as opposed to passing. And then Lorenzo Doss, who played with the Broncos and won a Super Bowl in his rookie year. Talked a lot about Peyton Manning, what it's like to play with him and get to know him as a guy that's 18 years younger than him. And it's been a nice run. So we're going to have a lot of Pelicans, a lot of Saints, former and current players, LSU, Tulane, anything that has to do with the region. Heck, I mean, if you have an Ole Miss guy you want to send down, we love the Rebels down here. I have a lot of friends that went to Ole Miss, a lot of strong contingent in this region. I just want to make a show that's entertaining and fun to watch. And so far, I've gotten really good feedback after the first 4 shows.
Welcome back to Hotty Toddy Hotline. Browning Stubbs here at the Hampton Inn in Oxford. We got Scott Alexander still on the phone with us of WLAE-TV. We love New Orleans too, Scott, and a lot of our viewers want to hear what's going on with some of the Saints and the Pelicans. You work for Scout, SaintsInsider.com, PelicansPride.com. Start with the Saints. So the Saints going into NFL free agency, lost tight end Ben Watson to the Ravens, lost Jimmy Graham last year. So they kind of need a tight end there. But, there's questions about the future with Drew Brees as a quarterback, has 1 more year on his contract. There's a name in Mississippi named Dak Prescott who possibly could be a big-time NFL quarterback. Do you see that the Saints trying to pick up a big quarterback, whether it's in the draft or maybe a guy like RG3? And then what are some other moves that you think they can make?
I can tell you've been in TV. You want to know why?
Why?
Because you made the same mistake that I always made, and it took me 3 full years to quit saying viewers when I'm on the radio. And I said viewers nonstop, and then everybody's like, dude, you're not being watched, you're listeners. So I finally got to listeners, and now I'm afraid now that I'm back on TV, I'm going to start saying listeners. But yeah, I get what you mean because I do it all the time. But as far as the Saints go, let's face it, I'm the most optimistic guy in the world, and I know that they have a lot of holes to fill. And I know that they're not that far away, but their defense, they didn't have anybody except for Cam Jordan that was able to get to the quarterback. So what they do with those guys, they just double team them if they know there's no danger on the other side. So with this draft being so heavy in pass rushers, defensive ends, outside linebackers, I say the Saints focus there because that's an instinct position to me. Yeah, you do have a lot to learn like you do in any position in the NFL, but other than running back, I think pass rushers are the most instinctive. So get the young guy there and fill some holes you have, and tight end might be one of them because we lost a really good guy and Ben Watson, like you mentioned today, to the Baltimore Ravens. That's a hard hit for me because I love him as a person, and I think he's just great for the team in general, on and off the field, in the locker room, and that's a big hit, bigger than most people would know. But they do have Josh Hill as a restricted free agent. I imagine they'll go with him and maybe get somebody. But I think more importantly, they need another offensive guard. Jari Evans is a 10-year guy, 6 years in the Pro Bowl. They ended up waiving him when he didn't want to take another pay cut, and they don't have much established there. They're good. They have really nice young tackles, a great center. But guard is where they really need to, I think, get a veteran at tight end. That might be one. And maybe somebody on defense. I mean, like I said, the secondary to me, people think when you're the worst passing defense of all time, and I say passing defense by most touchdowns ever given up, that it's all on your defensive backs. That is and isn't true. You have to have a pass rush, as you know. It's a big thing to say get to the quarterback before he gets to 3 Mississippi, as opposed to saying 2 Mississippi as an homage to your state, by the way. But so their defensive backfield's not that bad when they're healthy. They weren't healthy last season, but when you talk about Keenan Lewis and Delvin Breaux and Jarvis Byrd, who's never been healthy since he's been here, gets $9 million a year, and Kenny Vaccaro, not bad. Focus on getting the defensive end and maybe getting a veteran receiver now that Colston is moving on. As a free agent, like I was throwing out today on my show, Rashard Matthews, guys that were drafted in 2012. I'll put 5 names out there that I like. One of them being an LSU guy, Reuben Randall, Rashard Matthews, a couple of Cincinnati Bengals, Marvin Jones, Mohamed Sanu, or maybe even the fast kid Travis Benjamin from Cleveland. But Ole Miss has easily the strongest draftable players this year, as you know, and. We obviously Tunsil leads the group on the offensive line, but you also have Kimbichi. But to me, the biggest impact guy will obviously be, because everybody loves the flash of the skill position players, will be Laquan Treadwell. I mean, the guy is dynamite. I think he's can't miss, and he might not have that burning speed, but to me, he has football speed. Jerry Rice wasn't a burner per se, but he was faster than anybody when it mattered, when people were trying to chase him. I think Laquan Treadwell is much the same. I like Cody Core as a surprise, not to us in the SEC because we know how good he can be, but as a guy that you draft him in the middle rounds, maybe fourth or so, and you're going to get a steal in him. So Ole Miss's great recruiting is now going to be paying off in the NFL draft.
Thank you so much, Scott, and we'll talk to you down the road. All right, that's Scott Alexander. You can catch him on his TV show on WLAE-TV, Primetime Sports with Scott Alexander. Also, make sure you go give him a follow on Twitter at @DScottAlexander.
Hey, Rebels, your truck is here. Allen Samuels Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Oxford presents the all-new Ram Rebel. It's Ram, the Rebel way. Send an unmistakable signal. Rebel 24/7. Ram Rebel from your friend in the car business. Allen Samuels Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Oxford.
Come by, let's be friends.
And we are back on the final segment of this week's Hotty Toddy Hotline. Once again, thanks to Browning Stubbs and his great interview that we heard earlier with Scott Alexander of WLAE-TV down in New Orleans, a place that did you make it down to the Sugar Bowl?
Oh, I sure did. It'd been 1970, so how many years? 46 years since I was last there.
I didn't make it to that 70 one for some reason.
That was outdoors, John.
I
We
know.
froze that day, but won also.
Yeah, I beat Arkansas in a great game at Tulane Stadium, which I'm glad to see. Tulane has built another stadium on that same site, and now they're playing football down there outdoors the way it ought to be played. But we're back here on the Hotty Toddy Hotline, our final segment with Steve Vassallo of HottyToddy.com. I'm Jon Rawl, and we can't thank you enough for being with us here on this show. Going to switch over from basketball now and talk about a sport that's a little bit happier to talk about right now. Ole Miss baseball. They've only lost one game on the season. I think they're 15-1 right now, heading into the conference opener at Tennessee this weekend. Steve, your thoughts on what Mike Bianco's doing?
Well, Mike Bianco is doing an incredible job with this year's team. They're 15-1, and when you look at the overall SEC right now, John, this may be the preview of Omaha we're seeing right here in our league. It's you come out of this league with a great record, you're going places, and we've got 5 teams right now in the SEC that have won 15 or more games. Florida right now has the best record with 17-1, and then Ole Miss is right there, 15-1 with Vanderbilt and Texas A&M. But we've got some real quality teams in the league this year, and our pitching seems to be the strength of this year's Ole Miss team. There apparently is no weakness on this Ole Miss team, and I've been to about 4 or 5 games already. We lost that one game we lost, I think, was to Louisville when they were ranked number 2 in the nation. Mm-hmm. So we got beat. We won the series, but we did get beat by a respectable team. But if you haven't seen Ole Miss play baseball in a while, this is the year to come up here to Oxford and see this team battle. They are fantastic.
They're fantastic, and as we said, the fun begins in conference play this weekend with a trip to Rocky Top. Now, before they head up to Knoxville, they've got a couple of midweek games against the UAB Blazers, and while that's kind of important, these are games taking place in the Magic City of Birmingham. Ron Polk is still a volunteer assistant baseball coach for UAB. Ron Polk of Mississippi State fame, still in the game, but not a paid coach. He's a volunteer assistant coach and just loves baseball, and that's the way that he's staying involved. So that's kind of interesting.
That's a name I haven't thought about in many years, but I'm glad he's still around. And
well, he's always been the ambassador of how college baseball players get the short end of the stick from a scholarship standpoint, and I love that about Coach Polk. He's not afraid to call the NCAA out for its hypocrisy, because those baseball players work just as hard as any other sport. And for some reason, I think they're the only sport that they have to divide scholarships up into halves and thirds and things like that. It's just kind of silly. But the Blazers and the Rebels midweek action, and then at Tennessee. Tennessee's been the worst team in the SEC, let's just be honest, in college baseball for about a decade now. They've been just awful. And hopefully, for their sake, they'll have a better season this year, maybe have some kind of postseason chance. But for Ole Miss's sake, it's pretty. If you're going to go on the road in the SEC, I guess Tennessee's about its most hospitable place you could find.
That's right. That's right. It's not fun going up there and competing in any sport, but I think this year we'll have a major advantage. John, there are a lot of great series coming up this year in baseball, but one is going to have almost like a World Series atmosphere, and that's when LSU comes in here, I believe, on April the 29th for that weekend series, April 29th and 30th, and it's May 1st. But that will be typically LSU is the strength of the SEC, and usually they're the team to beat. But so far this year, we've got a slightly better record. They're 12-3. We're 15-1. But when we enter SEC play, that'll be a crucial series for sure.
Right. And the fun really begins actually next weekend when South Carolina, which won back-to-back national championships, they are coming in for the first SEC home series next weekend at Oxford University Stadium. So it's college baseball season. It's a big deal here in the state of Mississippi, and Ole Miss offers you a chance to see some great college baseball action. Steve, thank you very much for coming on once again with us.
John, thank you. It's always exciting to talk about Ole Miss sports.
And what you got working on the website, HottyToddy.com?
Well, right now we're focusing on a lot of different subjects, mainly some art projects that are coming up here with elementary school children. I'm involved with the Kiwanis Club. We've got a big double-decker contest next month in April, and the winners of each of the 4 grades, John, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, receive chicken for a year from Chick-fil-A. So it's quite an inspiring contest, especially for those children.
Steve Vassallo, check it out, HottyToddy.com. He is determined to make Oxford and Ole Miss great again. Jon Rawl signing off with you. Folks, we have enjoyed you being with us, and Browning will be back in the saddle next weekend from a Charter Road hospitality property near you. Until that time, have a great week. This has been Hotty Toddy Hotline, a production of CRM Sports on the Colonel Reb Radio Network.